So a lot of research on autism focuses on children, which is in part, as you know, due to the great potential of early diagnosis and interventions in alleviating the severity of symptoms that people may experience. However, as I think Paul greatly pointed out during his talk, there are many adults with autism who have real needs in transitioning into adult life, and in particular, the area of employment. So the majority of adults with autism, it's estimated between 50 and 70% are unemployed or underemployed. And there are some companies like Microsoft and even companies like Specially Sterno, which is dedicated specifically to helping people on the spectrum get matched with good career opportunities. So there is beginning to be some realization in the private sector that this is an area to work on. And so on this slide, I show a picture of the well-known autism advocate Temple Grandin, who is herself autistic. And she has a blog where she shares some of her opinions about autism. And on her blog, she says, some job tips for people with autism or Asperger's syndrome. Computer science is a good choice because it's very likely that many of the best programmers have either Asperger's syndrome or some of its traits. And I think this is a really interesting comment because it plays into sort of a cultural meme or stereotype that many of us may have heard iterated over and over, this idea that Silicon Valley and Seattle's extension of Silicon Valley is populated with people who are somewhere on the spectrum. There was a famous Time magazine article a few years ago where they had a picture of Bill Gates on the cover, and it was called Diagnosing Bill Gates, and it was speculating that perhaps he was on the spectrum. And I think this is really interesting to think about because there isn't actually any data necessarily to back this up one way or the other, but if we believe that there is some non-negligible percentage of tech employees who are on the spectrum, what does that mean? What does that mean for Microsoft as a technology company? Should software companies that are now trying to explicitly recruit people with autism, like Microsoft, SAP, HP, et cetera, be changing any aspects of not just their general HR practices, but actually the practice of software engineering itself? There are many standard workflows and techniques and pieces of software that programmers use. Are those well suited to the skills and aptitudes of what may be a substantial proportion of the workforce? So I think these are some really interesting questions. And so to better understand this area, my colleagues and I conducted interviews with tech employees at Microsoft and also at other companies nearby that are also involved in technology to better understand what their experience is as a tech employee on the spectrum, and to help us think more about what tech companies might do to help these employees reach their full potential. So this page is just showing a chart giving some basic demographic information of the 10 people that we interviewed. So we conducted interviews, and I want to just go over here some of the key themes that emerged from those interviews. So the first is around diagnosis. So of the 10 people that we interviewed, 9 of them were diagnosed with autism as adults and not as children, which I think is really interesting. There's probably 3 main reasons for this. One is that these are people who were children at a time a couple decades ago when diagnosis and screening for autism was less prevalent than it was now. Another is that many people in the tech industry come from overseas. Many people, for example, of Asian origin, maybe being born in countries, again, where autism screening is less common than it is in the US. And also, these were, all the people we interviewed were people who were hired at their companies through the normal application process, so not through a special process such as the one that Neil just described. So presumably people who are able to make it through the very stressful and rigorous typical interview processes maybe have less severe symptoms perhaps, which might enable them to avoid diagnosis early on. So people who were diagnosed as adults said they were diagnosed either because they had children who were themselves on the spectrum, and having their children diagnosed prompted them to recognize many traits in themselves, or because of workplace issues. So people receiving poor performance reviews at work because of misunderstandings with coworkers and management, often resulting from some of the traits of autism that were the cause of these misunderstandings. And so then they would be go to a mental health professional because of these workplace issues and learn that they had autism. And actually, I think this diagnosis issue is very important because for these individuals, when they received a diagnosis, this was actually really valuable to them. It was a relief to understand what had been maybe causing them trouble and some tensions throughout their life, but also enabled them to develop plans, and specifically in the workplace, to develop coping strategies for some of the workplace issues that they experienced. Another theme is the issue of disclosure. So half of the people that we interviewed had not disclosed to anyone in their workplace that they had autism. And the main reasons were, one, the social stigma. So many people actually use the language associated with the gay rights movement to talk about autism. So people would talk about being in the closet or not having come out at work as being autistic. And one person put it very well. He said, neurodiversity is where race, sex, and sexuality were a few decades ago in terms of the stigma still attached to it. And then, of course, people were concerned about discrimination. So someone said, I think I have lots of skills, and I want to be judged on my skills and not on my diagnosis. And so in the cases where people did disclose, they weren't disclosing to their managers, they weren't disclosing to human resources, they were disclosing to maybe one or two trusted peers in the workplace who they felt they had a close personal connection with, and often it was because that person had brought up autism. So it was typically like a coworker who had a child on the spectrum who was discussing at work that they had a child on the spectrum, and so then this employee would feel safe coming out to them that they were also themselves on the spectrum. Another theme, we looked specifically, since we were talking to technology employees, at how their status as a person with autism impacted their role as a software developer. So one thing that came up several times, which would not be surprising to people familiar with autism, is that these employees had very rigid interpretations of rules, and so in particular rules associated with programming. So programmers are often given, for example, certain style guidelines that they should adhere to, the ways that they should name their variables or their methods and functions. And of course, most programmers don't always adhere to them very strictly, but especially at big companies like Microsoft, developing products takes place in a team, and there's multiple people who are all contributing code to the same project. And so if people's colleagues weren't adhering strictly to the style guidelines, this was viscerally upsetting to the coders on the spectrum. Also, software engineering processes, for example, the agile programming process, which is something that teams follow in order to get their software delivered. Again, this is a process that has very strict and formal rules, but in practice, as it's executed by different teams and different companies, individual groups adapt and change the rules, but this sort of deviation was very problematic and upsetting to these employees. Also, many of the engineers on the spectrum shared with us that they had while they had great focus on certain types of programming tasks that interested them, others were very difficult to focus on, especially if they didn't feel it was intrinsically important. So for example, testing code to simulate ways in which an end user might break the application was very difficult for some of these workers because the idea of envisioning that someone else would use the software in the wrong way was very tricky. And then of course, some of the social interactions that are part of the development process in sort of modern large software companies. So there are often meetings called code reviews and code critiques where peers on your team will walk through your code with you and help check it. And having code critiqued could be very stressful for these employees. And then, of course, in addition, there's a host of challenges that just come not necessarily specific to the software industry, but in many modern workplaces. So, team meetings, office politics, environmental distractions. Many tech companies in particular have been going to the trend of open plan offices instead of private offices, which can have more sensory stimulation challenges for people on the spectrum. At many companies like Microsoft and other large companies, there's frequent changes and reshuffling in the organizational structure. Maybe you work on Xbox this year, but in 2 years you're going to work on Microsoft Office. And so you have to get to know a whole new manager and set of peers. For people on the spectrum, that can be hard. We asked people whether they had requested any accommodations. Actually, very few had, mostly because they hadn't disclosed formally that they were on the spectrum, so therefore weren't entitled in the system to request accommodations. So we also asked people, well, hypothetically, if you did feel comfortable making such a request, what would you want? And some of the types of requests that were common surprised us. So thinking about business travel, which is often a part of a software engineering job, you have to attend conferences to brush up on the latest skills, learn about the latest tools. This was difficult for people. One person said he really needed to sit in business class. I mean, we all wish we could always sit in business class. But because in the economy, there were so many people near him that social stress was very difficult. And so he would actually get his doctor to write notes saying he had a bad back, even though he didn't, because he needed an excuse to explain why he couldn't sit in the economy class since he hadn't come out as autistic. Being able to have team meetings recorded or have someone else take notes, because the need to pay attention to both the content of the meeting, but also understanding the complex social structure and rules and who could talk and when was too challenging for many people on the spectrum. Being able to have the ability to maybe work from home or attend some meetings remotely over video conferencing, again, to sort of step back on some of that social stimulation. And finally, one thing that I thought was really interesting, because many people on the spectrum have children on the spectrum due to some genetic components, that an employer who wants to attract and retain employees on the spectrum probably needs a health plan that offers really good benefits for children with autism as well, as that's something that employees would really value. We also talked with employees about any strengths that they felt autism brought to their role as a software engineer. 6 of them spoke about recognizing patterns, and that pattern recognition is really helpful, and it is, right, for debugging code and structuring code. Also, being able to focus really intently. So some people would talk about they would program, and they wouldn't even stop for lunch or to go to the bathroom. They were extremely focused. Having extremely good coding style, again, because they follow all the rules quite literally, and having out-of-the-box thinking, being able to solve problems that their colleagues couldn't solve. So we wanted to see if some of these trends extended to a larger group beyond the 10 people we interviewed. So we did conduct a survey with a larger sample, about 800 Microsoft employees. So we asked people to take the survey regardless of whether they were neurotypical or not, because we wanted to see if these trends were different for the neurotypical versus neurodiverse employees. And again, what we see, at least in terms of people's self-ratings with this larger group, again, we see this trend where the neurodiverse software engineers reported more challenge in areas such as code reviews and testing code, but reported more skill than neurotypical employees in detecting patterns in code and having very good coding style. We also saw trends in terms of the kinds of communication people preferred. So asynchronous communication, like email and texting, was more preferred by neurodiverse employees than things like phone calls and face-to-face, because it gave them more time to both process the incoming material from someone else and also to kind of compose their thoughts more carefully, double-check them, check them that the tone and the style was really correct, maybe have someone else look at it and sanity check before they sent it to a manager. And then finally, in areas related to other aspects of office life, again, with this larger sample, we saw more challenge for neurodiverse employees in things like, attending team meetings or having your manager be changed to someone else in the organization in terms of the amount of stress and concern this caused. So based on these findings, our suggestions for employers looking to help grow and retain and just help their neurodiverse employees reach their potential is, one, to be aware that their estimates of how many employees may be affected by conditions such as autism is probably an underestimate, because what we see is people are very concerned about disclosing or even getting diagnosed. Some employees may not realize when they join the company even that they have autism, so estimates are probably very low right now. We think it might be valuable for employers to include in training materials that they give to all employees, things like sexual harassment training that everyone has to take. There should also be some sort of neurodiversity training that everyone has to take. This might help for helping remove some of the stigma that might then facilitate disclosure and enable people to get the accommodations they need, as well as helping perhaps employees realize that they see certain traits in themselves and seek out needed diagnoses or accommodations if necessary. The open plan office trend in the tech industry, I think, is particularly problematic. It's kind of hip and cool, but it may not be the right thing for a diverse workforce. And then asking employees specifically, again, something that all managers should probably do to be a good manager for all their employees, but asking about communication preferences. Do you prefer communication via phone or via email? Would you prefer to attend meetings in person or remotely? That kind of thing can help all employees be more successful, but particularly neurodiverse employees. So I want to thank you for your time. We have a much more detailed report that goes through some of this research, which you can download at this URL that I put up on the slide. Thank you.